Hello and welcome. In this video we will be looking at the next 5 dungeons on the list and see which element is best to use for each of them. The 5 dungeons are Scaraleaf Dungeon, the Tofu House, the Haunted House, Skeleton Dungeon and Bwork Dungeon. Let's start right away with the Scaraleaf Dungeon. The Scaraleaf Dungeon introduces a new aspect to my sheet. Most of the mobs have a 100% resist in at least one element. My sheet treats the 100% as if it was 90%. Otherwise, the result of the calculation would be an infinite number. 90% is much higher than the other resists in this dungeon, so it should provide enough distinction in the final results. If you don't know how my calculations in this sheet work, I advise you to watch my previous video in which I cover the 5 F2P dungeons and also explain my calculations. When we look at the final results for this dungeon, we see that the earth element in combination with the neutral weapon is clearly the best choice, simply because having a neutral element weapon makes it possible to bypass the 100% resist on every monster in this dungeon. All other elements will struggle with the 100% resist monsters, at least a little. So that was the first dungeon. Let's see what the Tofu House results look like. The Tofu House has no big differences between the elements, but if we look only at the last room, the level 40 monsters, we will see that the water element is the best element to choose. Simply because the water element has 3 out of the 4 monsters with a negative resistance, while the other elements only have 1 or 2 monsters with a negative resistance. Overall, the water element is also the best choice, but I don't think you would struggle when you're one of the other elements, because the difference is little. For the next dungeon on the list, it's a whole different story though. The Haunted House introduces another new aspect to my sheet. The resistances of the gargoyle are unknown at the start of the fight, therefore I cannot include it in my sheet. The fire element is by far the best choice, since all monsters are non-resistant to fire. The air element will have a difficult time in the last room. The Dungeon Keeper has a whopping 85% resistance for the air element. And if you're unlucky with the gargoyle, you might be in for a real challenge. The other elements are not too bad. Fire element is much better, but earth and water wouldn't give you any problem. So if you run the air element on your character, you should definitely consider switching to the fire element or get another person to help you out. Let's see if the next dungeon on the list, the Skeleton Dungeon, is as exciting as this one. Well, resistance wise, the Skeleton Dungeon is the most boring dungeon on this list. The water element is the best element to choose, followed closely by the earth element. The others are not far behind, so there's no need to switch elements here. Let's quickly continue to the last dungeon on the list. The Bwork Dungeon only has 4 different types of monsters. The Dungeon Keeper heals her allies, so you might want to kill her first. When we look at the resistances, we will see that all monsters are at least somewhat resistant to fire, and the Dungeon Keeper has a 48% resist, which makes her a lot harder to kill if you run in the fire element. There is not really a difference between the other 3, but again the water element comes out ahead. In the overall results, we see that I left out the Scaraleaf Dungeon. The big differences there would make these total results completely useless. This is caused by the 100% resist on most of the monsters there. 3 green marks in the water element column shows us that for these 5 dungeons the water element is the best to choose. The opposite is happening for the air element, which is the worst for 3 out of the 5 dungeons. The difference in total number of damage you'd have to do is also quite big, while the earth and fire element are in between those. We see that for the air element you have to do 5000 damage more than you would have to do in the water element. That's more than 10% difference. That's quite a big difference, so you will struggle a lot more when you're running in the air element. There are 4 more dungeons to go before we have finished this level 1 to 50 category though, so it might all change, but we leave that for the next time. So that's it for this video. Let me know if this video was useful for you, and hopefully I will see you on the next one.